Okay, so welcome everyone to the monthly virtual gathering of the Canadian Ecopsychology Network. Hello, my name is Carol Koziel and I'm the founder of CEN. Today, we're going to hear from Dr. Sara Granovetter about animals and the unsayable, how unconscious defenses keep us from metabolizing systemic animal exploitation. First, a little bit about Sara. She recently completed her doctoral dissertation entitled The Asymmetrical Mirror, Non-Human Subject as Shadow and Self at the California Institute of Integral Studies in an Ecopsychology concentration under the guidance of Gay Bradshaw and Craig Chalquist. Sara also holds a master's in counseling psychology and a bachelor's in philosophy from Harvard University. For the past 10 years, Sara has worked as a somatic depth psychotherapist in private practice and as director of Fiddleheads, a nature-based program for children with social, emotional, learning differences. Recently, Sara has shifted her attention towards ecopsychology and animal advocacy. Thank you so much for sharing your time and wisdom with us today, Sara. I'll turn the airwaves over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Carol. And I'm very honored to be here today and to dive into this dense, deep, somewhat dark topic together with you all. So I will just start sharing the screen right away. We can get right into it. Okay. All right. So the title of this presentation is Animals and the Unsayable, and it is based both on my doctoral research and my own personal experiences in the field. I always knew that I didn't feel comfortable with traditional forms of animal activism, which felt sort of divisive and alienating to me. And I also felt perplexed and curious at the level of emotionality and defensiveness on both sides of this topic. So my research is my own personal attempt to understand the forces that drive this debate and to find a new way forward. So, what if I told you right now that I was about to show you a picture of an animal suffering on a factory farm? And so take a moment and notice your body language. What is happening within you? Are you flinching, looking away, closing your laptop screen, maybe feeling dread, preparing yourself? Are you annoyed? Okay, so just go ahead and get ready. Oops, it's probably not what you were expecting. So what happened just there when your expectations were not met? And just as a caveat, I'm not going to show any graphic images today because that would be against what I'm arguing for today. And so how do you feel towards this animal on the screen, as opposed to how you might have anticipated feeling about the suffering pig or cow cowering behind bars? So let's just take a moment and study that curvature, the difference in breath, of thought forms, of sensation and body language in these two cases, the original expectation and in the actual event that occurred. Just take a breath here. And I'm going to move on to another image. What about this image? What is your response? And maybe you are a hardcore vegan activist and you're feeling, yeah, and your own fire is rising up. Or maybe your feelings are somewhat more conflicted and you feel a combination of things, a shrinking, a shying, a defensive shield forming in front of your heart. You can even take a moment here to feel into your heart, into your chest, into your defense systems. Breathe into what's coming up for you. So we can think of these two instances, these two photos, as opportunities for self-study, and just think about what you learned about yourself in those moments. So I'm going to talk a little bit here about the field of ecopsychology, and this is not to pick on ecopsychology, not at all. I feel most at home in ecopsychology, and it's where I situate myself. But we're going to start here because this is where we are. So in these fields, in the field of ecopsychology and environmental studies, there's plenty of talk of animals, the decimation of species, reverent discussions of animals in the wild and our interactions with them, interspecies co-regulation and reciprocal healing, the mystery and intimacy of the other than human world. And these are all really beautiful, valid, and worthy explorations. There's nothing at all wrong with them. However, there is an imbalance. I believe there's an imbalance. I believe there's a blind spot and an important omission here that is a source of unspoken tension. And so what's left out of a lot of discussions is our complicity in the suffering of captive, commodified, and consumed non-human animal individuals, and explorations of how we can face and respond to this situation. Of course, there's plenty of exceptions. There are, many wonderful ecopsychologists, maybe not many, but a few that I know of who do address this topic. Gabe Bradshaw and her concept of transspecies psychology, Mary Watkins, maybe Val Plumwood, if you could consider her an ecopsychologist, maybe Mark Beckhoff. I'm not sure if he's considered an ecopsychologist. And I'm sure there's plenty of other important known names that I've omitted, and please feel free to point me towards anything I've missed. But aside from these luminaries and the passing mention of animal agriculture as it relates to other ecopsychological phenomena, the field is largely silent on this topic. And the world is largely silent on this topic. But I think this is a really important topic for ecopsychology to explore. The relative silence on this subject, it does not add up with what I see as some of the central tenets of ecopsychology, a field that seeks to decenter and recenter the human psyche in the web of life, to regain our ecological sanity by situating ourselves within the other than human world. And how can we decenter ourselves in this way without looking with eyes wide open at our relationships with the animals who really do suffer to an unfathomable extent and scale in captivity? And I think this is also an important topic because it's one that we're all participating in, myself very much included. No matter how vegan, how organic, humane label reading, or I only buy meat from my friend's farm you are, we're all part of this society that's shaped by industrial animal enterprises. So can you spot the animals in these photos? Do you think about animals when you look at these objects? If you start to look around or even look down, I'm not even sure, this might have, I think it's linen, with a certain perceptual lens, you'll begin to notice that animals are always present in and on and around us as food, clothing, furniture, and the list goes on. Yet this ever-present relationship is collectively omitted from normative discourse, and most of us are dissociated from the relationship between these animal bodies everywhere and the living reference, from the fact that we're literally in relationship with these beings virtually all the time. So what I'd really like to explore is how are our psyches digesting this relationship with animals that's ever present on and in our bodies and around us, but collectively dissociated from as a relationship. There is an enormous gap in cultural discourse about the unfathomable magnitude of animal suffering and death that occurs through industrial exploitation. And this gap, it doesn't add up. It doesn't match our conscious attitudes. For instance, in a poll administered by the National Council of Animal Protection in 2014, 79% of people, 79% of people in the US believed that animals should be protected from all suffering and harm caused by humans. What? Here's another statistic for you. Another Gallup poll in 2015 showed that 1/3 of Americans believed animals should have the same rights as people. So if this is how the majority of animals feel, how can there be so much resistance to addressing the suffering of animals on factory farms? So in this presentation, I really want to bring this gap into our collective awareness, to name it, to name the tension, and suggest we begin by filling this gap in ecopsychology with questions, debate, and non-defensive listening and sharing. Right, so, oh gosh, there's one more thing I want to tell you here. I want to warn you here. I'm going right here to the DSM definition of trauma. But I want to warn you here that I am going to be using the word trauma in this presentation a fair amount. And I'm going to use it to describe what's in the way of coming to terms with industrial animal enterprises. And I know this term gets thrown around a lot these days. And it's important for me to name that I use this term both in the diagnostic and in the more vernacular sense. So there's big T trauma, there's little t trauma. And the truth is, even the DSM is shifting and changing the definition and the criteria for PTSD all the time, because there is a continuum of trauma, right? So I am going to be loose with this term for these reasons, and also because I don't always know myself, whether or not it constitutes diagnostic trauma or not. What I'm describing, this is an exploration that we can all kind of look at together. So the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders requires that the following criteria are met for a diagnosis of PTSD: exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in one or more of the following ways: directly experiencing the traumatic event oneself, witnessing in person the event as it occurred to others, learning that the traumatic event occurred to a close family member or close friend, or experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of the traumatic events. So learning about or witnessing someone you care about being harmed can bring up symptoms of, what's also called secondary stress syndrome, secondary trauma syndrome, which is kind of like is something that is often attributed to psychotherapists or people that work with traumatized victims. And also Melanie Joy attributes secondary trauma syndrome to vegan and animal activists. But witnessing harm directly can actually lead to PTSD. So fathoming the scale of harm and death caused to animals for our benefit in some sense is unthinkable and unimaginable in a society where 79% of people believe that animals should be protected from all suffering and harm caused by humans. Even though I cannot claim that confronting this issue is always or even often traumatic in a diagnostic sense, depending on the extent to which individuals engage, it certainly brings up deep feelings of guilt, grief, and anxiety that may not feel manageable. But I have developed the growing suspicion that to look at this issue full on and in a full-bodied way actually is traumatic, based on research I conducted with activists who bore witness to, shared gaze with, and engaged with animals approaching slaughter. And in my conversations, I found that all activists had either active PTSD, actually diagnosed by clinicians, sometimes not, or past symptoms of PTSD. So how could you might be wondering, how could PTSD result from witnessing, or maybe you're not wondering, maybe it's obvious to you, but how could it result from witnessing animals being harmed or soon to be harmed? So trans-species trauma can arise in these encounters. And this concept of trans-species trauma I get from the idea of trans-species psychology, which is a newly established field based on the recognition that science uses a unitary model of brain, mind, and behavior and consciousness for humans and non-humans alike. And so in our sharing of neural substrates with animals, it is natural for us to feel connected to and impacted by what happens to them. And one way this happens is through limbic resonance, which is the sharing of deep emotional states with others, a capacity originating in the limbic system. And the researchers attribute this capacity to all mammals and some birds, and theorize that it even crosses the species line through nonverbal cueing, allowing humans and non-humans to share affective states. Researchers also found that gaze sharing between humans and dogs triggered the release of oxytocin, facilitating bonding in the same way gaze sharing created intimacy between humans. So among the advocates that I spoke with in my research, these advocates are people that bore witness, that did open rescues on factory farms, who went in to kind of do investigations. And so 9 out of 10 of these advocates made eye contact or shared extended gaze with non-human animals on factory farms or ones that were approaching slaughter. And now eye contact is the means through which 2 subjects achieve neural attunement, activating the limbic system of both parties, as well as firing mirror neurons in select species. And there is evidence now that cows do have mirror neurons. And so for these 9 advocates that I spoke with, their attunement to animals in acute states of distress through gaze sharing was a frequent subject of flashbacks, intrusive thoughts, and other trauma symptoms that were pointing to post-traumatic stress disorder. So, I mean, this is all maybe to some extent understandable. And you might be asking, what does this have to do with people who don't enter into such extreme situations or confront animal suffering so directly? Well, I want to argue here that it's exactly this shared gaze that we as a society and culture seek to avoid, both literally and metaphorically. We avoid gazing into the eyes of this issue, averting our gaze from these animals that are existing on and in and around us. Because if we looked, we sense that there might be something unthinkable and unsayable, this traumatogenic nature of the industrial farming enterprise. And to begin to look at what's happening is to really face potentially a traumatic recollection. And it's something that we, all of us, and we collectively as a society already know viscerally without fully apprehending cognitively, without having it enter into our conscious awareness on a day-to-day basis. And so what does that mean? What does that look like? How can we know a traumatic fact and also look away from it, also not know it? Well, there's something called the unthought known. It's an idea that was created by the object relations theorist Christopher Bolas. And the unthought known refers to a pre-verbal, unschematized early experience or trauma that may determine one's behavior unconsciously. It's barred to conscious thought. There's also something called the unsayable. And the Lacanian theorist Annie Rogers conceived of unprocessed trauma as a silent unsayable around which unconscious behaviors and defenses recurrently constellate. Well, the knowing of this trauma, the knowing exists in what Lacan names the real. And in a very simplified way, the real might refer to the unencompassable knowing of our bodies. So the unsayable here takes us back to the title of this presentation. Hidden away animals and farms and slaughterhouses and laboratories are often unnamed, not because we don't care, and not just because they are masked from us by corporate, economic, and powerful political lobbies, although this is certainly part of it. They're unspoken because they're unsayable, in the sense that that which is unsayable is traumatic. So beyond these obvious reasons, why else might facing industrialized animal suffering be difficult, overwhelming, or even traumatic for us? Leading trauma theorist Bessel van der Kolk Peter Levine and Judith Herman all find that the absence or presence of a trusted individual to validate or make sense of a difficult experience can create or ameliorate traumatic stress. So, in addition, relational failure can happen between an individual and their culture. So, in other words, Western industrial societies' refusal to recognize and acknowledge the violence of animal agriculture constitutes a massive relational failure, making facing this reality a lonely proposition for many of us. And because it's so lonely, it's more vulnerable to traumatic or overwhelming responses when our feelings are not acknowledged and what we've seen is not acknowledged as important or real. Another reason why this topic is so difficult to face and potentially traumatogenic is because it brings up feelings of powerlessness, vulnerability, and what I call transverbal resonance. According to Bessel van der Kolk, powerlessness is a key component of trauma and can make the difference between an overwhelming experience and a traumatic one. Most of us feel pretty powerless when facing the enormity of industrial animal suffering, making turning towards it all the more treacherous. David Abrams says, "We cannot abide our vulnerability, our utter dependence upon a world that can eat us. Vast in its analytic and inventive power, modern humanity is crippled by a fear of its own animality and of the animate earth that sustains us." So to some extent, we can apply this quote to our avoidance of facing the enormity of industrial animal enterprises. When we are asked to turn towards it, we come into contact with our own powerlessness and vulnerability. As trans-species psychology kind of confirms that we are psychologically and physically continuous with non-human animals, it can be terrifying on a primal level to reflect upon what we so easily do to those with whom we increasingly identify. In 1960, Searle claimed that humans experience a primal anxiety, a feeling akin to how one feels when they're very, very young and small and without words, when they apprehend their deep connection to and dependence on nature. I believe that these same feelings come up when reflecting upon the immensity of industrial animal agriculture, an expression of and perversion of human nature. And if, as Abrams suggests, we already fear our own animality and immanence, how must we feel when we apprehend that we are embodied beings subject to the same embodied treatment as industrialized animals? We're all vulnerable to exploitation. We know in some part of us that humans also treat one another like objects. They dehumanize one another in a range of ways, from subtly to violently, in ways that are quite similar to what happens to animals on factory farms. For many of us, it's actually impossible not to identify, even if it's not so consciously, with animals on factory farms or in one way or another. And in this identification, there's something that I want to call a transverbal resonance. So when we are connected to animals who are rendered speechless, who are not able to advocate for themselves, whose cries are not heard or considered meaningful, we're brought to touch an otherness within the self that we suppress, that we ourselves suppress in a similar way that animals are suppressed on factory farms, called the shadow, if you will, or the orphan. This is a part of us that hasn't been heard, a part of us that's been objectified or ignored, that didn't develop the words in an early age to presence itself, to be seen, that wasn't mirrored. And when we try to communicate, if you've done inner work, if you've felt this feeling before, when we try to connect with this part of us, often it communicates just with a whimper. So this trauma that I'm presencing here, it's not just an individual phenomenon, it's present on a collective level. I want to suggest that industrial animal enterprises constitute a form of insidious collective trauma as well as personal. Now, cultural or collective trauma is a natural consequence of the essentially relational nature of trauma, where the ripples of trauma experienced by an individual or group kind of multiply and extend to touch an entire group, society, or civilization. Most characteristic of collective trauma, a term coined by Kai Erikson in 1976, is it involves a blow to the basic tissues of social life that damages the bonds attaching people together and impairs the prevailing sense of communality. And so while the designation of collective trauma has largely been used to describe the impact of widely documented violent events such as the Holocaust, it also refers to an ongoing practice that works its way slowly and even insidiously into the awareness of those who suffer from it. So it does not have the quality of suddenness normally associated with trauma. So while there may or may not be a rupture in communality among humans, actually, I think there is among activists and non-activists, among slaughterhouse workers and those who kind of keep them in that situation. While that rupture among humans might not be so obvious, there is a communal rupture in the trans species psyche. There's a rupture in our relationship with animals that are members of our community that is occurring in these industrial enterprises. And animal agriculture is insidiously working its way into our awareness. And the collective trauma associated with it is subtle and slow to rupture the veil of silence. And it's a form of what Inouye calls a haunting. Inouye in 2016 used the word haunting to describe suppressed traumatic memories that persist across generations and eventually rupture the veil of silence through collective actions. So there's a collective mandate right now. There's a systemic collective mandate to keep the knowledge, and even if it's not the knowledge, the continuous conscious awareness of animal agriculture suppressed, to keep our awareness of living animals separate and split off from the pervasive animal bodies that surround us. And one reason that this might be is because collective trauma can pose an identity threats to perpetrators or bystanders to violence. Acknowledgement of responsibility for trauma is inconsistent with perpetrators or bystanders' desires to see themselves as moral agents. A culture society must also protect itself from feelings of guilt and grief. So social groups can and often do refuse to recognize the existence of others' trauma by refusing to participate in what I will describe as a process of trauma creation. Social groups restrict solidarity, leaving others to suffer alone. This is a quote by Alexander in 2004. So those who bring forward the hauntings of collective trauma are designated a carrier group. And a carrier group is a group that carries the burden of trauma and brings public attention to its impact and importance within society. And this is also a concept created by Alexander in 2004. I would name the activists that I spoke with as members of this carrier group, as well as others that cannot help but viscerally experience and speak towards this collective trauma. So how do we know there's collective trauma? It's one thing to speak, that I think collective trauma is also something that's been spoken of a lot lately. And so what's the evidence for collective trauma around this topic? So in 2015, Judith Herman confirmed that repression, dissociation, and denial are phenomena of social as well as individual consciousness. So we can infer unprocessed collective or cultural trauma by what is most vehemently denied, silenced, and defended against within a society. We can infer trauma or unbearable affect and what is not said. And so this fits in with Annie Rogers' conception of the unsayable, which designated that which was chronically left out, a word or topic that is conspicuously absent. It is a deafening silence, a kind of black hole around which unconscious behaviors and defenses recurrently orbit. So what kinds of defenses do we see that point towards trauma? So in many individual and social groups, we can witness trauma in the censoring of discourse. We can witness the unsayable in what is not admissible, what is chastised, what is dismissed as crazy or hysterical, as many animal rights activists are, or in what is otherwise silence. So we can witness the censoring of discourse that problematizes animal industries and consumption of animal products in almost every discipline, social group, social cause, dinner table, unless of course you're going to your vegan social group outing. And we can also witness these individual defenses in the use of social discourse meant to numb affect and reduce empathy and relationality, such as referring to pigs as pork or slaughtering as processing rather than killing. We can also witness some of these defenses in the actions of splitting and projecting. And I'm not going to go too much into what splitting means here, but I'm going to describe it by way of example. So for instance, a layperson may become angry at an animal rights activist, labeling them as violent or crazy or unkind because they are confronting them with information that they do not wish to receive. This would be an example of projection, where the layperson or the recipient of the advocacy materials is actually defending against unbearable anxiety and a fear that maybe they are the ones that are violent and unkind, and projecting that onto the other. Animal rights activists employ splitting as well, some viewing non-vegans as irredeemable. Many I spoke to referred to themselves as believing that they belong to a different species as those who ate meat, viewing themselves as saviors and others as perpetrators, without acknowledging the extent to which we are all victims of depersonalizing industrial systems and unknowingly or unconsciously complicit in harm. AR activists can also hold guilt and trauma that feels so unbearable that it must be projected onto others. And finally, a really important defense is the literal silencing of activist witnesses through ag-gag laws and the Animal Enterprise Act. Two activists that I spoke to reported trauma symptoms stemming from prolonged persecution by federal agents. If governmental entities go to such great lengths to prevent the public from witnessing non-human suffering, these gatekeepers must believe that the reinstatement of connection may cause deep ripples of change. So we can also witness something unbearable at the core of the collective psyche in more systemic and geographic dissociative defenses. So for instance, one type of geographic defense would be removing a slaughterhouse from public eye, making the building windowless. Another way of using systems to perpetuate dissociation would be by depersonalizing the process of killing through mechanization. And finally, another form of dissociation, of kind of geographical dissociation, is the geographical concealment and division of labor in slaughterhouses, such that no individual worker feels responsible for the animal's death. All right, so If all of these defenses are a form of deafening silence, an absence suggesting a potent presence, how do we begin to bring industrial animal suffering into conversation? In our eco-psychology community and in all other communities, how do we do that if it's such a psychological minefield? So this is something that I myself am still trying to answer and I'm still working out, but these are the beginnings um, of my ideas. The first and most important piece here, I think, is inner work for all of us to explore intrapsychic resonance. Whether you are resistant around this topic, ambivalent, or you're a fervent activist, looking into how messages about non-human suffering in which you may be complicit impact you. So, like we did at the beginning of this presentation, when you encounter animal suffering or something comes up in your feed, a graphic image, attend curiously to your reflective reactions. Do you flinch, scroll past? Do you cry uncontrollably, filled with rage, or kind of numb out? And so unless you have a history of trauma, you might go one step further, noticing where in your body you resonate. You might even ask, what is the part of me that cries or whimpers along with the animal, is silenced along with the animal? Is this animal? And how have I neglected, scrolled past, flooded out, and absented this place within me? And what would it be like to truly be with this other within me and the other out there, and respond from a place of inner subjective ensoulment? And so this kind of approach, this kind of inquiry invites responses to animal suffering that emerge from the depths of the self, more inclusive and three-dimensional activism that acknowledges that human and non-human animals are co-muted and co-suffer. Another something else that I think is really important, and there is a lot of growing support for this, is happening, but support for animal activists, space for their feelings and emotions, because they are in some ways the symptom bearers and the carriers of collective trauma. They often embody the archetype of the wounded healer, often verging on savior. And so to help them advocate more effectively, they must have access to emotional support that acknowledges the disenfranchised corners of their own psyches that seek healing, a healing that they may solely project outwards with animal advocacy work. Burnt out, angry, traumatized activists can't really build bridges to the ambivalent public. And they don't really have space to be empathic to those who are not engaged in this work. So in addition to this, some suggestions I have is that in building a trauma-sensitive advocacy, we bridge this idea of it's us versus them. It's the people who care versus the people who are just callous and uncaring and jerks and just privileged, or it's those crazy animal rights activists versus me, who's sane and just knows that this is a part of life and we have to accept it. So bridging that dichotomy, bridging that split. And when we can do that, if we are in animal advocacy, is by using we statements. So for example, instead of using a you statement like, you need to stop doing this, you need to stop eating animals, isn't it crazy that we live in this industrial civilization where animals are harmed in such a deep, personalized way, and it's so hidden from our view? So another piece that I think can be integrated into advocacy is normalization. If, for instance, if someone is resistant or doesn't want to talk about these issues, an example of a statement might be, I get it. It's so difficult to think about these topics. It's so disturbing to imagine what happens to animals. It's almost unbearable. And it's normal to feel sad and resistant to it. I want to look away all the time. Another something else that can be employed is systemic acknowledgement. Isn't it something that we are so indoctrinated to eat industrially processed meat at such a young age, and that we're led to feel that our bodies and minds and our survival depends on it. Isn't it crazy the way we're not supposed to talk about this, that we're indoctrinated to steer away from this topic? And finally, I really want to advocate for agenda-free spaces, open, affect-friendly spaces where vegans and non-vegans can process their feelings about animal harm, animal suffering, industrial enterprises, as well as processing their sense of guilt, complicity, ambivalence, resistance, and grief, and all the feelings that come up around animal consumption without a final agenda, without the pressure to make a change in that moment. Even though that might not feel satisfactory to a lot of activists, I really think that's essential to making this conversation accessible to the wider populace. So that concludes my presentation. Okay. Well, the screen went away, but I just had a little, I was going to share with you my contact info, but that's okay. I'll just let Carol do that in her follow-up email.